Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Butterfly Conservation's Members' Morning and Annual General Meeting. This year's meeting is being held online, so we want to ensure as many members as possible can attend. Like you, my colleagues and I are all in our respective homes. I'm down in the far south of England in Dorset, and we would love to know where you all are today. Please do say hello in the live chat function. We have Russell Hobson, Butterfly Conservation's Director of Business and Research, and Steve Gray, Butterfly Conservation's Director of Engagement and Volunteering, manning the chat function today. They're really looking forward to saying hello and answering as many questions as they can throughout the morning. We are going to try and make all of our transitions as smooth as possible, but I want to apologise in advance if our home Wi-Fi's let us down or one of us forgets to unmute ourselves. We do have some backups waiting in the wings if technology lets any of us down. I also want to apologise in advance if any of the speakers have the post person ringing the bell or we have dogs barking in the background. It's definitely one of the downsides of being live from our homes. Today could not happen at all without the hard work behind the scenes from the head office team. Today, Sarah Adlam has been joined by Fabian Harrison, and they have worked extremely hard to bring this event together for us to enjoy. And I want to say a huge thank you to them. We wouldn't be here without them. Also, just to let you know, this event is being recorded and it will be available to watch again in the next week or so on our YouTube channel, and links will be available on our website. There's lots to look forward to this morning, and we have some fascinating talks lined up for you all after the formal AGM has concluded. Martin Spray will be introducing you to BC's new chair, Simon Saville, and then I'll be welcoming Dr. Richard Fox, BC's Head of Science, to talk about BC's research network. And then I'm going to be immensely proud to be able to introduce the newly qualified Dr. Rachel Jones, BC's Senior Ecologist, who's going to be talking about our conservation work on the Lulworth Skipper. And finally, this morning, we're going to be hearing from our keynote speaker, Craig Bennett, who's the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, and he's going to be talking to us about the future of nature recovery in the current climate. But all of that is still to come. So as you may be aware, BC's Chair, Martin Spray, is stepping down as a trustee at the close of the AGM today. So for now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over for the final time to BC's Chair, Martin Spray.
Thank you, Julie, and good morning to everyone, and a warm welcome, certainly, to Butterfly Conservation's 2025 AGM. I will now formally open the AGM, notice having been given properly served, together with the agenda, council election addresses, and proxy voting details, all of which were circulated to all members with the 2024-25 Annual Impact Report. Firstly, apologies for absence. We have received apologies from BC Trustee Elaine King and BC members Roderick Chapman, Dudley and Jean Cheeseman, Carol Gent, Harold Goff, Caroline Jackson-Horston, Philip Reynolds, Angela Scales, and Rowena Ward-Barrow. We move on to the minutes of the last AGM held on 9th of November 2024. The minutes of the meeting have been published on our website, and as they have been made available to those wishing to see a full copy, I'm going to take them as having been read. Proxy votes on the resolution to approve the minutes have been cast in advance. We have received 282 votes in favour, 3 votes against, and 40 votes abstaining. Thank you all. The minutes are approved. There are no matters arising. The next item we come to is the annual report, and I will now present the Chair's report to members. Butterfly Conservation, as you all know, is a high-achieving and increasingly important organisation. And so I was delighted back in 2023 to be invited to be a trustee, and then to take over from Karen Goldie Morrison to serve as chair. The inspiring strategy I inherited was just one of the many aspects that drew me to butterfly conservation. Butterflies and moths are so appealing and engaging to me, and indeed people of all ages. Butterflies were my first and lasting encounter with nature when I was only 5 years old. It has been a great privilege to serve as your chair over the last 2 years. We have recruited some excellent trustees to increase the breadth of the governing board. If I reflected on 2024-25, there is no escaping that it was a difficult year, not just for this organisation, as we all know, and in the need to respond to the external environment, the political decisions, the financial situation with the cost of living increase, competition for funding, and the endless challenge of protecting nature. We've had to make some difficult choices and decisions, yet we are in a sound financial position made possible by taking necessary action early and to the very prudent management of our resources. We are weathering the storm better than some in the charity sector, and despite all that, we continue to develop and deliver great projects making a substantial impact. Just to reflect on a small set of examples of what's been achieved in the last 2 years as reflected in our annual impact reports. Firstly, species conservation work covering over 62 species from the greenweed piercer in Somerset to large heath in Northern Ireland. The £700,000 raised for work on the northern brown argus in the Scottish borders. Collaborative species projects like those with Nature Byth in Wales. The number of people engaged in wild spaces projects in Perth and Stirling, Bristol and Western, Leeds, and big city butterflies in London. And I'd just like to say that that focus on urban, I think, is very important because that's where most people live and where we can engage even more with the people who will hopefully support us and support our work. Our first ever youth panel challenging our ways of working and strengthening our understanding of how to reach more young people. So important. The biggest ever international symposium, and now 9 PhD students supported by the Heather Corrie Research Fund. Over 42,000 people signed our letter to get pesticides banned. The biggest ever participation in the Big Butterfly Count with all the amazing press and social media coverage. And we've begun to modernize the organization with the digital technology to enable butterfly conservation to adapt and change in a very rapidly changing world. I'm extremely proud of what we've been able to achieve despite the difficulties we face. And that is wholly down to Butterflies Conservation's people. It is with great pleasure that I thank my fellow trustees, Julie Williams, CEO, the senior leadership team, the whole staff body, and of course, all of you, the members and all our volunteers and supporters. I'm also grateful for your support during my time as chair. And I'm happy to hand over the role of chair with the organisation in a stronger, more forward-looking position. This organisation is needed now more than ever in our nature-depleted nation. And if we all work together, trustees, staff, members and volunteers, I'm very confident that it can continue and increasingly make the impact it has been doing. I shall be watching its progress and continue to offer whatever support I can. So thank you all. Thank you. The next item is the Treasurer's report to members. This report will be presented by Hugh Ellerton, our Honoured Treasurer, and I will now pass over to Hugh.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honour to present the Butterfly Conservation's report as Treasurer to you all. Today, I am reporting the financial results for the year ended 31st of March 2025. Last year, I reported we had emerged from the post-COVID period in a stronger financial position with increased income, allowing us to invest in conservation and research, vital to fulfill our ambitious conservation strategy targets. However, this year has seen a significant decrease in our legacy income, causing an increased deficit and the need to reduce our expenditure across the board. Last year, we reported a deficit of expenditure over income of £208,000. This year, we incurred a deficit of £842,000. Income the blue bar, fell by £56,000. Expenditure, the orange bar, increased by £8,000 in the year. This graph portrays the 10-year trend, showing our income falling off and expenditure static in the year. This bar chart, while demonstrating the healthy and prudent diversification of our major sources of income, shows the unpredictability of income. Grants, donations, and membership subscriptions rose only slightly in the year, but legacies were £762,000 below the previous year. Legacies are a vital, if unpredictable, income source for butterfly conservation, as it allows us to invest in delivering our strategy. If you are interested in adding butterfly conservation to your will, there is more information on the website, or you can contact our legacy team for more information. This graph shows that our membership income rose a little in the year, and the 10-year progression of individual and household members. It demonstrates how critical members, you, are to the continuing success of the butterfly conservation. The 7-year upward trend of membership numbers until 2020 has leveled off, reflecting the cost of living crisis in recent years. But the vast majority of members have remained loyal over the years, for which we thank all of you for this important support. However, we hope we can return to a stronger upward trend, and all of you can help by encouraging family, friends, and colleagues to learn more about butterfly conservation and join as members to enable us to increase our voice and also to continue to expand our conservation research and engage more people. Our free reserves of £3.78 million remains at a healthy level. These reserves are crucial for us to ensure we can cope with fluctuations in income, for example, grants, donations, and legacies, which I alluded to earlier. This year, we have spent £5.9 million on conservation activities, more than at any time in our history. Our endowment fund, which stands at £5.5 million, rose 1% in the year. I am pleased to say the fund has risen considerably since the year end. We continue to operate a sustainable investment policy with a low carbon footprint and higher social dividend than the relevant MSCI benchmark figures. As has been announced, I am stepping down as a trustee and treasurer, and I hand over the role of honorary treasurer to Steve Armand, with whom I have been working closely over the past year. During my tenure as treasurer, income has increased by 40% and our costs by 60%, notwithstanding the impact of COVID and subsequent high inflation and the spiraling cost of living. Our balance sheet remains very strong. I would like to express my thanks to Julie Williams, the senior leadership team, and all the finance team, in particular to Charlotte Davidson, the Chief Finance Officer, for their support and hard work in producing unqualified annual accounts every year. And finally, I wish to propose 2 resolutions. Firstly, we adopt the annual report and consolidated accounts and balance sheet for the year ended 31st of March 2025. And secondly, we appoint Buzzicott as auditors and authorize the council to fix the remuneration for the financial year. I will now ask Martin to report on the results of the proxy votes on these resolutions, which were held in advance of this meeting. Thank you. Martin.
Thank you, Hugh. The proxy votes on the resolution to adopt the annual report and financial statement have been cast in advance. We received 293 votes in favour, 2 votes against, 30 votes abstaining. The annual report and consolidated accounts and balance sheet for the year ending 31st of March 2025 are therefore approved. Next, we need to appoint auditors and authorise council to fix their remuneration. We believe that we've been particularly well served by Buzzacott over the last year. We remain extremely pleased with their diligence in dealing both with the accounts and any other technical matters where we seek their advice. You has proposed the reappointment of Buzzacott and for council to be authorised to set their remuneration. Proxy votes on the resolution to appoint the auditors have been cast in advance. We received 284 votes in favour, 3 votes against, 38 votes abstaining. The reappointment of Buzzacott and authorisation for council to set their remuneration are approved. Next, the Chief Executive's report. We now come to our Chief Executive's report, and it is my great pleasure to pass you over to Julie Williams.
Thank you, Martin. 2025 has been called the year of the big squeeze for the voluntary sector. Charities have found themselves in unpredictable and challenging times. It's been called the perfect storm, created by funding falling, costs increasing, and demand climbing. And with the public under significant financial pressures of their own, charities are feeling the strain and face increased competition for every single pound. We have seen mass redundancies across the whole sector. On the global political stage, we've seen several conflicts resulting in devastating humanitarian crises and widespread human suffering, and the world around us today remains extremely volatile. And if we move on to the environment, the news is also depressing. A study by Miles Richardson, a professor of nature connectedness at the University of Derby, has highlighted that people's connection to nature has declined by almost 60% since 1800. Computer modelling predicts that levels of nature connectedness will continue to decline unless there are far-reaching policy and societal changes. You already know that more than half of the UK butterfly species are in long-term decline, with 80% of species having decreased in either abundance or distribution. And 33% of Britain's larger moths have also declined in abundance in the last 50 years. You often hear people say that UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. You just heard that from Martin. According to the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and that estimates how much of an area's natural biodiversity remains, England ranks 7th worst out of 240 countries and territories that are assessed worldwide. Northern Ireland is 12th worst, Wales 16th, and the Scotland 28th. Governments need to do more. The current total UK agricultural budget spent on agri-environmental schemes is just under £870 million. The estimates of scale of need to meet climate and nature targets is a whopping £5.9 billion on agri-environmental schemes alone. Government funding across the UK is falling so far short of what is actually needed. I'm afraid that we see no real signs that this is going to change anytime soon, with the major political parties announcing plans to reduce or remove environmental regulations which they believe are preventing growth, despite there being no evidence to support this. And to top off my gloomy start this morning, the UK saw its third dullest October on record, recording just 63.3 hours of sunshine across the month. Wow, there is so much for us to be depressed, concerned, and worried about. When I feel despondent and frustrated at the state of the world, I remember that butterflies symbolise hope because they represent transformation and new beginnings. They're seen as this powerful metaphor for growth, resilience, and a brighter future. Their life cycle represents the ability to change and renew, And the resilience and endurance of a butterfly represents the ability to adapt and endure in a changing world. And let's not forget the wonder of seeing a butterfly for the first time after a long winter. And just like a butterfly symbolising hope, butterfly conservation must never lose hope. We must continue to be ambitious and have endurance. We must continue to evolve in this ever-changing world, because without this determination and our work, things would be so far worse for the butterflies and moths that we all work so hard for. Through collaboration with volunteers, landowners and partner organisations, we have saved the Duke of Burgundy on the North York Moors. The bright wave moth continues to spread in Kent, and we would not have the high brown fritillary on Exmoor or in South Wales. And we continue to develop and deliver amazing projects that are making a real difference. As Martin said, we have new projects on the large heath in Wales and the north of England, and are growing Scottish borders. And we're delighted to be part of Peace Plus Nature, an ambitious programme of 9 partners working together to stop the decline of priority species and habitats and strengthen our engagement and volunteering work in Northern Ireland. I just mentioned that we need to evolve and keep changing, and this has never been more important. The fight has moved away from where familiar on-the-ground solutions will work. The key drivers of change, climate, pollution, land use change, well, they affect whole regions and countries, and we need to adapt our advice, what it is, and how we deliver it. And that is why, through the Heather Corrie Research Fund, we're investing in understanding these drivers. How pesticides affect caterpillars at seemingly sublethal doses. The impact of nitrogen deposition on upland calcareous habitats. And how do we give species introductions the best chance of success as their climate shifts? And while the work we funded on the impact of agri-environment schemes in England is yet to be published, a recent study by Jarvis in 2025 showed that there are positive correlations between agri-environment scheme implementation and butterfly abundance and species richness at landscape scales. Our ongoing research with UK CEH is attempting to unravel the mechanisms beneath these landscape scale results. But research takes time, so we have another tool in our armoury. Our butterfly and moth data is at the core of the UK government's legal targets for species abundance and threatened species. If the government is going to achieve the targets of halting and reversing the decline in nature, they are going to have to deliver improvements and funding to improve the population trends of butterflies and moths. And in the meantime, we need people to act as the voice for nature and hold governments to account. Across whole countries of the UK, we need people to drive change where they live. We had over 42,000 people sign up to our butterfly emergency petition. Over 5,000 people have already signed up to our pesticide campaign. And over 1,700 people have contributed to the Big Insect Recovery Plan. We'll be launching the Big Insect Recovery Plan next year in time for the local elections in England and the country parliamentary elections in Wales and Scotland. I talked at the beginning about the lack of nature connectedness, and I am thrilled that over the last 2 years we have engaged thousands of people through our Wild Spaces projects in London, Perth and Stirling, and Bristol and Weston, including almost 2,500 children at over 70 workshops. This work has inspired and given hope to children, teachers, parents, and the wider community. Our volunteers and branches continue to be champions of our work, from the vitally important biological data they collect to increasing quality habitat for both threatened and widespread species on landscapes across the UK, to engaging people across whole communities and inspiring them to take action for butterflies and moths. We're so fortunate to have an amazing army of dedicated, knowledgeable and inspiring branches and volunteers supporting our work, and we need more people to volunteer across all areas of butterfly conservation so that we can make an even bigger difference for nature. And that's why our growing volunteer project gives me hope for the future. The project is reviewing the way we work with volunteers against a backdrop of organisational, societal and economic change. And it's going to determine the volunteer strategy and operating model which will best support our work in the future. A huge thank you to the volunteers who are helping shape this work. It is so important that our volunteers have a voice in this project to help shape what volunteering with butterfly conservation will look like in the future. And what's also encouraging across the environmental sector is the increasing desire for organisations to work together to have a stronger voice to fight for nature. Collaboration is key. A shining example of this was at the recent Wild Summit in Bristol, which BC played a pivotal role. We had a strong presence in the promotion of the event, and our collaboration with BugLife and Bumblebee Conservation Trust promoted us as a collaborative organisation who successfully works with others to achieve ambitious goals. We need to do more of this. Our voice needs to be louder, bigger and more influential. Working with partners helps us achieve this. I talked earlier about the extreme funding pressures on charities, and this makes my thanks today to our project funders, to every person that has left us a legacy, to every person who has donated. More important, we really do appreciate every single pound we receive. And to you, our members, thank you for your valuable continued support. Because of you, we're able to continue to fight for butterflies and moths. Because of you, we continue to connect people to nature. And you all give me hope for our work to continue in the future, making a real difference for the species that we all care so much about. And just like a butterfly, our Board of Trustees is constantly evolving and transforming as we bid farewell to trustees and welcome new ones to the board. It has been a true personal pleasure working with our chair, Martin Spray, and Hugh Ellerton, our retiring treasurer. And on behalf of all the BC staff and trustees, I want to say thank you for your support, your wise counsel, and your incredibly hard work. I mean it when I say we are really going to miss you. Looking forward, I'm excited to work with our new chair, Simon Saville, and our new treasurer, Steve Almond. My job is made easier because Butterfly Conservation is so fortunate to have the best staff team. And I am grateful for every single one of them, and I want to praise their incredible work and say thank you. They're led by a brilliant team of directors, so a huge thank you to my senior leadership team. The role of an environmental sector CEO is not for the faint-hearted. So what gets me through every day? What makes me more determined to fight for people to have the right to access green spaces, to create opportunities for people to connect to nature, for this amazing organisation to have a bigger, louder, more influential voice, to bang on the doors of government and shout that this is not good enough. Nature needs more. Our under threat species deserve better. So what gets me through the day is one word: hope. I hope for a better future for generations to come. I hope that we can together, every one of us on this screen today, and the army of volunteers, members, supporters and partners continue to fight to make a difference and be the voice for nature and for butterflies and moths. And yes, I know the world is a frightening and depressing place right now, but please never forget that ray of hope that every sighting of a butterfly and a moth brings. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I don't think I could have put it any better than that at all. It's a not a happy world at the moment, but it's organisations like Butterfly Conservation, with everyone that's involved in it in whatever capacity, that are making a difference, and that gives us that hope. So thank you. Next, we come to the council elections. The longest serving third of members of council are required to stand down from the office at each AGM. If they have served for less than 9 years, they are eligible for re-election along with any other Butterfly Conservation members wishing to stand for election. There are 4 vacancies on council this year. Lawrence Harwood has stood down by rotation. Lynette Leeson and Dr. Ruth Waters were co-opted onto the board after the 2024 AGM, and as required are standing down for election. Hugh Ellerton has decided to end his tenure on council after 5 years, and I'd like to say a big thank you personally to Hugh for his dedication and commitment to council and butterfly conservation over the years. He's also been a good friend to me. Thank you. I've decided to end my tenure at council after 3 years. Lawrence Harwood is entitled and willing to stand for re-election. Lynette Leeson and Dr. Ruth Waters are entitled and willing to stand for election. One new candidate submitted a nomination to stand for election, Dr. Simon Spencer. Simon submitted an election address which was distributed with the invitation to this meeting. Simon was nominated, is eligible, and has made a declaration. There are sufficient vacancies for these appointments to take place without a contest. Proxy votes were cast in advance, and I will now read the results for each candidate individually in alphabetical order by surname. Lawrence Harwood received 256 votes. Lynette Leeson received 260 votes. Dr. Simon Spencer received 272 votes. Dr. Ruth Waters received 261 votes. So pretty similar voting capacity. Proxy votes on the resolution to appoint Lawrence Harwood, Lynette Leeson, Dr. Simon Spencer and Dr. Ruth Waters as trustees have been cast in advance. We received 310 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 14 votes abstaining. So I can formally declare that Lynette Leeson, Dr. Simon Spencer and Dr. Ruth Waters have been appointed as a trustee, and Lawrence Harwood has been re-elected as a trustee. Thank you. Next, we have the Q&A session. In the AGM notice, we requested that questions be submitted in advance. No questions have been received. The final formal item is to notify you of the date of the next AGM, which will be Saturday, the 14th of November, 2026. And next year, our AGM and members morning will again be held online. We look forward to seeing you there. I would now like to hand over to BC's new chair, Dr. Simon Saville, who would like to say a few words and introduce himself.
Thank you, Martin. It's a huge privilege to be elected as chair of the Board of Butterfly Conservation, an organisation I first joined back in the 1980s. Having grown up in rural Dorset, I've seen how much our countryside has changed over the years and the impact this has had on our butterflies and moths. And butterflies and moths need our help more than ever right now. Through our volunteers, our branches, our staff, our projects and our partners, butterfly conservation has achieved a lot over the years, as you've heard. And that great work continues. But the fact is that we need to do more if we are to turn things around for butterflies and moths. We need to have more impact with the resources at our disposal and to have a stronger voice for nature. And those are some of our strategic goals that we take forward. But we can't do this alone, even with the combined efforts of thousands of volunteers around the country. We'll need to guide and mobilize others to improve habitats for nature if we are to arrest the declines of butterflies and moths. There's lots of work to do, but butterfly conservation is well equipped to take on the challenge. It will take all our combined efforts, but I'm confident that we can succeed. Thank you very much, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Simon. I'm absolutely delighted that you agreed to take this on. You're absolutely the right person for the job, and if I can be of any support in the future, I certainly would like to be so. So, ladies and gentlemen, I can now formally close this, my final AGM. It's a big thank you to all of you for giving up your Saturday morning to tune into this. It's obviously all of us like in-person meetings better than online, but with the increasing costs of everything, I think this is a very good way of handling it. I will now pass you back to Julie, who will host the rest of the morning. So thank you all.
Thank you, Martin. And again, on behalf of the BC staff and volunteers, I would like to say a huge thank you again to both Martin and you for all that they have done for butterfly conservation. We've now finished the formal part of this morning, and we're going to take a short break to give you all a chance to stretch your legs and get a cup of tea. We'll be back at 10:50, where I am really looking forward to seeing you all again so that we can continue with our members' morning. See you soon. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've got a nice cup of tea because I am incredibly excited about the next hour and a half. So I hope that you can settle in and enjoy the next hour and a half with me. We have 3 great speakers lined up for you. Please do use the live chat function. We can see all the chat, lots of chat about brown hair streaks, which is brilliant. So please do use the live chat function if you have any questions for the speakers. I can't promise that we will have time to put them all to the speakers, but we will do our very best. The first speaker needs little introduction at all. Our very own Dr. Richard Fox, Butterfly Conservation's Head of Science. Richard is going to lead us through the history of and more recent developments in our science and research work. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much, Julie. I am indeed. So it's great to be here. And let's get my slides. There we go. So 5 years ago, I spoke at this Butterfly Conservation Members Day about how the evidence that we gather, so that's the butterfly and moth records that you contribute, have made a big, important contribution to our understanding of how climate change is affecting our wildlife. We've made some significant steps forward in our research work since then. So over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to highlight some of these big steps in terms of the scale and the scope of our scientific research. Butterfly conservation prides itself on an evidence-based approach, but our remit for research runs much deeper than that. This is the very start, the first half of the first page of Butterfly Conservation's Articles of Association. That's the legal document that defines what butterfly conservation is, what we do, our rules, how we're organized, and so on. And right here in the first half of the first page is an objective that butterfly conservation will carry out research, scientific research, particularly on butterflies and moths, of course, and particularly in the context of human activities, the impacts that human activities have on these amazing creatures. So it's right there, front and center, not hidden away in the small print, but right there, front and center in butterfly conservation's existence. When I did the talk back in 2020, I showed this chart really just to illustrate the range of different topics that butterfly conservation staff are involved in researching. I was highlighting climate change back then, which is why that sort of slice is highlighted, but I'm showing it again just to give that overall view. So this chart is based on over 160 published papers published in international academic journals involving butterfly conservation members of staff up to 2020. And it doesn't include many other contributions that butterfly conservation colleagues make to other publications, so things like British Wildlife or Entomologist Record and Atropos and so on. Also back in 2020, I made the point, and it's still extremely relevant today, that the data that you gather and the science that we do with it is a really, it's one of butterfly conservation's unique selling points. It's a really big part of what makes us punch above our weight and be held in the national and international respect that we are. Our scientific studies, the papers that we publish, have been cited tens of thousands of times in other publications, other important publications, including those from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, things like the State of Nature Report and the Living Planet Report, and of course in our own publications as well. And of course, over the last 5 years, we've continued to do science, to publish papers. There are just a few examples coming up on the screen from the last sort of few years. And all of this work is highly collaborative. So it involves us working with a wide range of organisations across the UK and indeed around the world. Many of them are universities, but not all of them. We work with research institutes, with museums, and with other wildlife charities to conduct our research. So that's all great. And as I've already mentioned, I think butterfly conservation has contributed some really important research findings, and we've built a strong reputation for our involvement in scientific research. But the vast majority of the research that we'd done until recently was what I'm calling reactive research. And what I mean by that is that butterfly conservation was sitting here with this huge pile of data generated by the wonderful citizen science recording and monitoring schemes that we run. And somewhere else over here, a researcher comes up with an idea and then approaches us, perhaps wanting to use some of our data, perhaps wanting to use some of our expertise, or a bit of both. And that inevitably, or almost inevitably, leads to a collaboration. So that was what I've described in those few minutes was kind of the past situation. And I'm now going to go through some of the significant changes that have happened over the last 5 years and discuss sort of the, where that kind of leads us really. And the first one is that thanks to a huge amount of work by Dr. Nigel Bourne, in 2021, butterfly conservation was awarded Independent Research Organisation status. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how we achieved that or what it means really, but it does put us in a very well-regarded, amongst a very well-regarded group of organisations. So there are a select bunch of other wildlife and nature-based sort of organisations that have this status. And then across other sectors, there's a bunch of household names ranging from really famous museums to CERN, the physics where they split atoms and do all sorts of incredible stuff. So this is the kind of table that we're at in terms of our research. This independent research organisation status is a badge, if you like. It's an official recognition that butterfly conservation is able to carry out important, relevant, and impactful research. Also in 2021, butterfly conservation published its ambitious 5-year strategy. And that strategy also talked about our research. It talked about a strategic shift to scale up our research, increase the amount of research that we do, and particularly research focused on the key drivers of change, the things that are affecting butterfly and moth populations. So a strategic decision, a strategic rebalancing, if you like, a move towards more proactive research. So I've already talked about reactive research, and reactive research is still important. We will, of course, still respond positively when researchers from outside of butterfly conservation come to us with ideas. We'll respond positively to that. That's important. It maximizes the use of all of the amazing biological records that you contribute through our recording and monitoring schemes. But that's not enough in itself, because those questions, those topics that external scientists might come to us with, they're not necessarily the questions that we need to answer in order to achieve butterfly conservation's vision and goals. And that's why we need to be much more proactive our work, in our research work. And we have always had elements of proactive research. So I'm thinking about the student projects that we've run for many years. So projects that we've created for undergraduate and master's level students to encourage them to explore the world of Lepidoptera and make a contribution towards its conservation. But we need to really scale up that side of the work. That was the result of this sort of strategic decision. And of course, that requires resources. We can't just like do that. It requires increased capacity, increased resources. And we were incredibly fortunate the following year in 2022 to receive a major donation specifically for research in the form of a memorial fund for Heather Corrie. And pretty much the first thing we did with that money was to employ Dr. Elizabeth Hordley as a full-time researcher at Butterfly Conservation. And Elizabeth's time and expertise made an immediate impact. It enabled us to start to take forward a whole number of different research ideas that we'd had on the to-do list, but never really had the opportunity to pursue. So the first thing that Elizabeth worked on was the effect of climate change on over 70 species of moths that are adapted to colder climatic conditions. So species that occur in Britain but require cooler, damper climatic conditions. And she showed that these moths were retreating in the face of rising temperatures. On average, they're shifting northwesterly, and that they are trying to track the retreating climatic conditions that they prefer. One of the really interesting findings from this research was that in places where rainfall is really high, these northern moths were getting some level of protection from increasing temperatures. And the reason why I think that's important is that, of course, we can't control the amount of rainfall, but we can control the amount of that rainfall that stays on sites and in landscapes. So we can do that with management. So think of the wonderful work that our bog squad does up in Scotland. So by retaining more water in sites, more of the rainfall in sites and in landscapes, we can give these northern moths a measure of protection against the ongoing rises in temperature that they'll face in coming decades. The second example of important, impactful research that Elizabeth led on was using our citizen science data to show that if you have some long grass in your garden, you will on average see more butterflies and a greater variety of butterflies. And that this beneficial effect of long grass was proportionally greater in suburban and urban areas. And these findings were publicized widely by the media, and they've been used to great effect by Butterfly Conservation's communications team and our campaigns team to promote evidence-based, wildlife-friendly gardening advice. And most recently, Elizabeth showed that the rate at which new moth species are colonizing Britain is accelerating at a steady rate. So she found that each decade, 21% more new moth species become established in Britain than in the decade before. So each decade, there's 21% more again than in the decade before. About 2/3 of these moths are getting here under their own steam. They are the result, their arrival here and their colonization here is a result of climate-driven range expansion from continental Europe. And the other third are arriving with inadvertent human assistance, largely as stowaways in the international trade in horticulture. So the employment of Elizabeth and the work that she's been doing at Butterfly Conservation over the last few years has been a really important way of increasing this proactive research, but it's not been the only way that we've utilised this Heather Corrie Fund to achieve this. So there's been other ways of investing in in-house capacity. So my own role as head of science was created. That also helped to build capacity. And these things have given us the ability to do things like take on external research contracts from other bodies, and to invest time and effort in developing research funding bids. We've also used some of this money to directly commission research from other organisations. So, for example, looking at the genetic basis for pesticide sensitivity in our butterflies and moths, or understanding better how agri-environment schemes affect butterfly and moth abundance and diversity in field margins. And we've also used it to develop, and in some cases to fund, new PhD projects where more research will be done. And to put that into some kind of context, when I was doing this talk back in 2020, or similar talk back in 2020, Butterfly Conservation had supported, in its entire history, had supported 4 PhD students through to complete their doctorates. Since 2020, 7 students have completed their PhDs with Butterfly Conservation support, and we currently have a further seven students whose PhD research is underway. So here they are on the screen. Most of them, so all of these students have a Butterfly Conservation supervisor in addition to their university supervisors. As you can see, they're based all over the UK. They're working on a wide range of topics, but most of them are pretty directly linked to the drivers of change. So there's one there on pesticides. There's another one on light pollution impacts, for example. And many of these students only started their projects last autumn. So they've only been going for just over a year. So there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of new research going to be coming down the tracks from this, this group of wonderful young researchers. And to add extra value and to provide extra support to these researchers, we formed a Butterfly Conservation Research Network. So every couple of months, these students and relevant butterfly conservation staff meet together. We network with each other, we exchange experiences, and keep up to date with each other's projects, which is all going really well. Of course, Butterfly Conservation's capacity to supervise such projects is limited, but it's nevertheless important that we continue to develop new projects, partly because there are always more questions that need answering to help us achieve our goals of conservation, nature recovery, but also to ensure the long-term continuation of this big expansion of Butterfly Conservation's research work that I'm talking about. And so, in addition to the students who are already in place that were on the previous slide, shown by the green dots here, we've had a new student start very recently, whose project is going to be focused on the large heath butterfly, and we've got 2 projects in development that we hope, touch wood, will lead to new PhD projects starting next year. Another way in which Butterfly Conservation is supporting early career researchers nowadays is through the Diasia Awards. So these are small pots of money given in honour, in memory of Dr. Douglas Boyes, shown in the picture there, who tragically died in 2021. And since 2023, we've supported 5 PhD and master's level students to extend their research on topics that are directly related to UK Lepidoptera conservation. And applications are currently open for the 2026 Diasia Awards. So it'd be really interesting to see what projects get put forward for next year's awards. So I'm just going to talk now for a few minutes about some examples of our recent research and the impact that it has in the real world. You'll hear more of one example in the next talk by Dr. Rachel Jones. I could easily have included her research in this amongst these examples if it wasn't for the fact that that would be stealing all of her thunder for the next 20 minutes or so. So instead, here I'm focusing on the work of Patrick Cook. So Patrick has been doing a lot of work on the impacts of commercial forestry on moths and bats, and has provided really good evidence that irregular forestry management practices are beneficial for moths and bats compared to traditional plantation methods. He's also shown benefits for moth communities of natural regeneration of native woodland in the Scottish Highlands. Sorry, struggling to remember that word for a moment there. So some really, really exciting stuff from Patrick. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with the wonderful project that Butterfly Conservation led to introduce the checkered skipper back to England after over 40 years of extinction, but perhaps less aware of all the science that went on before, during, and after that reintroduction to ensure that it was a success. So this included modelling work, modelling habitats, modelling climates, so that we could choose not only the best reintroduction sites, but also the best donor sites for the checkered skippers. It included developing a new method for monitoring the reintroduced population using photography to identify individual butterflies. And it involved a genetic assessment of the reintroduced English population, which came up with a fascinating discovery that all of the English checkered skippers are descended from adults from just one of the two Belgian source populations. So the other Belgian source population, although adults were introduced into Northamptonshire, they've left no offspring at all, which is really fascinating. And we have a PhD underway now to try and understand why that was the case, and most importantly, to learn any lessons that might be really important to benefit future reintroductions of this, or indeed other butterflies and moths. You'll definitely be very familiar with Butterfly Conservation's Big Butterfly Count, an incredible project that has been so successful at raising awareness, engaging people, and bringing well-being benefits to the participants. But the snapshot nature of Big Butterfly Count, the fact that it occurs in that 3-week window in the middle of summer, does present problems for analysis. And these are exemplified by the fact that the flight season of each species changes from year to year depending on the weather. So I can't point at this, unfortunately, with a cursor, I've been told. But in the top left graph there, you see, the 4 charts there show the flight curve of marble white butterfly in 4 different years. That's the black line over time. And the blue bar is the timing of when Big Butterfly Count happens. So if you look at the top left, which is the year 2011, marble white arrived early. It emerged early that year and was almost finished. Most marble whites had finished flying by the time of Big Butterfly Count. The very next year, in 2012, Big Butterfly Count hit bang on the peak of marble white flight period. So that's a problem in terms of analysis, and presents a different kind of, but an equally important kind of research issue. And Dr. Emily Dennis has resolved this. She's created an entirely new way of analysing the Big Butterfly Count data that accounts for and adjusts for this changing timing, the changing phenology of each species, each summer in the analysis. And having done that, she's then able to go on and produce trends from the Big Butterfly Count data, trends that are not affected by this timing issue. Emily's also made important contributions through a series of EU-funded projects to the development of the European Grassland Butterfly Index. So that graph there, the Grassland Butterfly Index, represents the changing fortunes of 17 grassland butterflies across the whole of Europe since 1990, and shows a massive 50% decline over that time. So finally, I'm just going to say a few things about some new areas of research coming up. So we've done a huge amount in the past, and indeed in the last 5 years, on some drivers of change. So the references that are on the slide there all recent high-profile publications, particularly focused on these drivers of change, so land use change, climate change, and light pollution. But of course, there are other drivers of change that we've focused much less on in the past. Pesticides I've already mentioned. We have a PhD running at the moment looking at pesticides. And we've also been doing work and continue to do work on nitrogen pollution. So nitrogen pollution, what we're talking about here is not sort of local nitrogen pollution where there's a, like a slurry pit overflows on a farm or something. It's not that local scale stuff. This is the nitrogen pollution that comes down in the rain. So as a result of burning fossil fuels in our cars and everywhere else, we're putting lots of nitrogen up into the atmosphere, and it then comes down in the rain. So the rain nowadays is dilute fertilizer. And that is profoundly affecting plant communities, the length and breadth of the UK. And that's almost certainly going to have knock-on effects on the insects, like our butterflies and moths that depend on those plant communities. So this work's not published yet, but this is from Will Langdon's PhD, which is finished, and so will be being published in due course. So we'll look to the impacts of nitrogen pollution on the performance and the survival of butterfly caterpillars. He also looked at the effects on how on which plants female butterflies choose to lay their eggs on. And Laura Sharp is going to be looking for impacts of nitrogen pollution in the long-term decline of moorland moths. So again, using caterpillars, here are some of her heather plants that she's got in the laboratory being fed different levels of nitrogen to mimic nitrogen pollution coming down in the rain. And then caterpillars will be put onto these plants in due course. And then just finally, disease. Of course, disease is a really important factor controlling the populations of butterflies and moths, but it's something that I don't think butterfly conservation has ever really been involved in any research on at all. So it's really exciting to be embarking on a project led by Exeter University that over the next few years is going to be characterizing the array of viruses in UK moth communities. So there's going to be a huge amount of exciting stuff coming. You can keep up to date, obviously, through the usual sources, through Butterfly Magazine and Butterfly Conservation social media channels, but also on the science pages of the Butterfly Conservation website and through our twice yearly Science News email. So everyone who's signed up, all the volunteers who are signed up to receive communications from us in Assemble will get this newsletter going forward. So just finally, thanks to all of you who submit any records, have ever submitted any records through our recording and monitoring schemes. That's the lifeblood of our scientific research. Thanks to all of the scientific collaborators that we have around the world. These people took the lovely photos that I've used in my talk today. And thank you for listening. And Julie, if there is any time, I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, brilliant. Richard, thank you. I always enjoy listening to you because whenever you speak, it is so interesting. And I've actually got a question for you while I'm waiting to see if the chat function team send any questions through. So I've got a question for you. I know how passionate you are about science and our research work. So my question really is about what is one technical advance on the horizon that's going to accelerate our research into butterflies and moths that gets you like super, super excited?
There are probably lots. I think the one that like we're really right on the cusp of, which probably may not sound all that exciting. I'll try and make it sound exciting. So this comes back to the independent research organisation status that I mentioned before. So we have this badge from the UKRI, as it's called, which is effectively the way that the government gives money to research funding, to fund research in the UK. Because we have that badge, we're about to be able to access supercomputing power. So at the moment, the research we do in-house is quite limited by our computer power. A lot of the models, a lot of the work that we do with the big data, we're talking about these millions and millions and millions of butterfly and moth records that sit in our data sets contributed by, all of us who are taking part in the meeting today. So this is big data stuff, and it needs powerful computers to analyze. And thanks to that status that we now have, our scientists will be able to access a supercomputer called Jasmine, which is available to organizations like ourselves to use. And that will make analyses possible. Well, not only existing analyses that used to take us a long time, much quicker, but also make possible, much more complex analyses that we just couldn't even consider doing ourselves before. And I think that will be in place in like 6 months' time. So that's like about to happen, and would be really exciting.
Yeah, which is fantastic, isn't it? You talk about the research that we are planning as an organisation, both internally as an organisation and then those with partners, Richard. What's the one piece of research that you want to personally do next?
Oh, that's a really good question. If I had like an unlimited check and unlimited time, I think that we still really need to get to grips with devising on-the-ground solution to turn around the declines of our common butterflies and moths. So something that can be rolled out by every farmer, every council, every landowner, land manager in the country, on our road verges, in our parks and cemeteries, and across our farmland, that will be evidence-based. We kind of know some of the things that might work, but to have, really good evidence base that this is what you need to do, and this will really turn things around. So I think that would be absolutely amazing.
Richard, thank you for that, Richard. Sorry, another question from me, sorry, is, and this, I'm putting you on the spot now.
You are.
I apologise, Richard.
I should have talked for longer.
I suppose for me, so I talked earlier in the AGM section really around governments needing to do more. What do you think as an organisation, Butterfly Conservation, could do more with our research to really bang on those doors of government?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So I think it's about having proven evidence, isn't it? So a lot of these things, and perhaps some of the people sitting listening to my talk thinking, well, yeah, it's obvious if we have long grass in our gardens, there'll be more butterflies. But when it comes to dealing with policymakers, and particularly with politicians, it's all about the proof. We can say what we think and what we know as people that love and study butterflies and moths, or people who are trained as scientists and ecologists, but that doesn't wash, unless we've got actual proof to demonstrate these things. So some of the pieces of work that I've been most proud of over the last sort of 5 or 10 years have really been proving things that we've known are, they're blindingly obvious to all of us as butterfly and moth enthusiasts and ecologists. But until you've actually shown it with real data in the real world, it doesn't get much traction in the policy space. So that's a bit of a general answer, Julie, but that's probably the best I can do at being put on the spot.
No, thank you, Richard. And thank you so much, as I say, for your highly engaging talk. It really was super interesting, and I hope everybody at home watching thought so too. Thanks ever so much, Richard, for giving up your Saturday morning to be with us. I am delighted now to introduce our next speaker, and I'm going to embarrass her slightly by introducing her as Butterfly Conservation's newest doctor, Rachel Jones. And you've just heard from Richard about how BC is able to fund really important PhD students. Well, Rachel completed her PhD at the end of October, and I'm extremely proud that as an organisation with a really strong research arm and passion, that we're able to give amazing opportunities to members of staff who can then go on to gain postgraduate qualifications, as well as advancing our knowledge of key species like the Lulworth skipper. So Rachel, a huge congratulations on your PhD. We are so thrilled for you, and we are very proud of you. And so for the very first time, I have the great honour of introducing to you all Dr. Rachel Jones.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julie. So today I'm going to be talking about conserving the lower skipper, and what we've learned about habitat management and microclimate. So the research today that I'm going to talk about today is from a PhD, as Julie previously mentioned, which focused on studying how the effects of habitat loss and climate change will affect our species. And through this PhD, we use the lower skipper as a kind of focal species to understand how some measures to conserve species might work in practice, and also address some of the knowledge gaps for lower skipper specifically. So today, I'm going to firstly talk a bit about species ecology and background. I'm going to give some context to population and habitat change, and then I'm going to outline what we've learned about habitat management and microclimate. So to start with, I'm going to give some overview on the lower skipper ecology for those of you that aren't familiar with the butterfly. So the lower skipper is slightly smaller and darker than some of our other orange skippers. It's a summer flyer. It will fly from June to August, but you do get records from May to September on some sites. During the summer, the female will lay eggs in batches of up to 15 in the stems and leaves of the larval food plant, which is tall grass. The eggs will hatch after about 3 weeks, and the tiny caterpillars will overwinter at the egg-laying site, spinning small cocoons. In the spring, the caterpillars will emerge. They'll disperse and individually form protective tubes quite high up in the leaves of the tall grass. They do this, you can kind of see a bit in the picture there, by spinning together the two sides of the leaf blade. From this protective tube, they'll then feed. They'll feed above and below the tube, usually at night, but you do get some activity in the day, particularly as the caterpillars get larger. They'll then pupate in late spring, early summer. So just to give a bit of background about where this butterfly lives, it prefers south-facing, unimproved, semi-natural calcareous grassland, so chalk and limestone grassland. It requires tall grass, and suitable habitats are often ungrazed or lightly grazed. These habitats include chalk downlands, so these are inland, often up to about 5 kilometres. They're often grazed. There's scattered scrub and scrub encroachment in places. We have these really large areas of coastal chalk and limestone, which include a mix of grazed and ungrazed areas. These include some very large sites and support most of our core populations, which is something I'll talk about a bit later. Other sites include quarries, car parks and verges, and here in the picture you can see Corfe Castle car park in the background, which is a popular lower skipper sighting spot, and then the railway siding in the background. So these sites are often small and are often unmanaged. Though my talk today will focus on lower skipper, it's important to mention these sites are often important for a range of other species, sometimes with conflicting habitat requirements, such as the Adam's blue and early spider orchid. So firstly, I'm going to talk about why this work was important and give a bit of background on the population status of this butterfly. So the butterfly is restricted to a 40-kilometre stretch along the south coast of Dorset, and you can see that in the grey map on the left. You can see a tiny bit of red on the bottom, and that's kind of the range of the lower skipper. The long-term trend from the UK BMS data set is one of decline, but actually the status trend over the last 10 years is more positive. What's important from this trend, though, is that it shows really large fluctuations in abundance. And this indicates that the population crashes will be occurring synchronously between sites. This can leave populations really vulnerable if all populations crash at once, and there's limited numbers there to recover the distribution and range. And this is particularly an issue for lower skipper because it's so restricted in its distribution, and the nearest chance of a colonising population would be in Europe. So to give a bit of background on this restricted range, so the lower skipper reaches its northern range limit in Dorset, and there has been no evidence of expansion over 40 years of study. And this is despite changes in climate over this time, and also evidence of expansion in some of our other butterfly species, which are well documented. Work in 2008 predicts that the climate suitability for the lower skipper should improve, and more of the UK should be more favourable climatically by 2050. So that's despite this, but the butterfly hasn't shown any evidence of expansion. What we have for the lower skipper is a really unique data set, and this includes snapshot surveys of habitat and population data over 40 years with surveys in 1978, 1997, 2010 and 2017. And in 2018, we were able to expand the distribution surveys further to look for evidence of range expansion and also map potential habitats. There are not many species for which we have such a comprehensive data set of habitat and population data from across a whole range. So the lessons we can learn from work on the lower skipper could be important for some other butterfly species and other insect species, particularly restricted specialists. So I'm now going to talk a bit about what the distribution surveys showed. So here we show the number of colonies in each of the snapshot surveys. We show in 1978, there were 84 colonies, but this had decreased by 1997. And just to set some context here, in 1978, there were large areas of lightly grazed grassland following post-war abandonment and the impact of myxomatosis, which reduced rabbit numbers. So this meant there were large areas of tall swards, which the butterfly prefers. In 1997, there were more conservation grazing schemes active for some of our shorter turf species, and rabbit numbers had recovered. So over this time, changes in habitat will have impacted the number of colonies. Between 1997 and 2010, colonies decreased further. And on the plot of the UKBMS data I showed previously, it shows that 1990-10 had the lowest abundance in the butterfly's recorded history. So actually that is reflected in the contraction in the number of colonies there. But by the time the surveys were done through the PhD, the butterfly colonies had recovered. And though the number of sites are similar in 1997 and 2018, the number of colonies actually did show quite substantial changes in status over this time. So what I mean by that is on the map, the pink dots there show sites which were occupied in both 1997 and 2017. And then we have the purple dots, which shows those that were occupied in 1997, but had gone extinct by 2017-18. And this could be due to changes in habitat or land use and scrub encroachment over time. And then we've got those which are more positive. They had recolonized by 2017-18. And for most of these sites, that was because of a change in habitat. And then we've got some new colonizations and discoveries. And then we've got patches of habitat that were visited. This doesn't all have suitable tall grass, but there was some tall grass present. So that just shows the distribution of those patches. So the drivers of distribution change, I've mentioned variation in habitat quality over time and how that can influence colonies. There's also likely to be a weather impact, which ties into how the population fluctuations. And when we see those crashes, the butterfly is likely to contract away from sun sites. These are usually going to be small or very low quality habitat patches within the distribution. So I mentioned the snapshot surveys. So in those surveys, we collected data on lower skipper density. So that's the number of butterflies along a transect. And for this, we converted it to numbers per hectare. We collected data on vegetation height and the cover of tall grass, the larval food plant. So over time, we show it here on the box plot on the left that the butterfly density decreased and then had a partial recovery, which we actually saw in both the UKBMS trend data and the number of colonies. This coincides with a change in vegetation, so a decrease and then increase in vegetation height. But along this time, we have a decrease in the cover of the larval food plant. And it's possible this is due to some sites receiving less management and becoming more scrubby. So the grass height's increasing, succession is progressing, and we're actually seeing a bit more scrub and a bit less tall grass. So that can explain why we're seeing an increase in vegetation height, but a decrease in tall grass, which is actually quite a dominant species. So using the habitat data from the snapshot surveys, we really wanted to understand how habitat affected the population density on sites. So here we have a graph, and on the bottom, we've got vegetation height up to 50 centimetres, and then we've got lower skipper density on the y-axis alongside, and that's numbers per hectare. The three lines show how the population density for lower skipper changes by vegetation height for three different tall grass covers, 60% in purple, 80% in orange, and then 100% cover in the blue. we show that the lowest butterfly densities occur in very short grass, so that's about under 15 centimetres, and very tall grass over 40 centimetres. And actually that the highest densities are in grass height between 20 to 35 centimetres. We also show that the butterfly density increases with food plant cover, and you get the highest densities where tall grass cover is 100%. Before this work was done, we did know from Jeremy Thomas's work that the butterfly liked tall grass. But what we've been able to do with these models is actually determine thresholds of suitability. And that's really important, particularly when you're advising land managers and schemes to tell them what kind of vegetation height they should be aiming for and having confidence in that. What this also shows is that actually lower skipper is a mid-successional species, which makes it quite tricky for some land managers. If you're managing grass for the butterfly, you're likely to bring it into this early successional stage because and that will affect the density of the butterfly. But again, if you leave the site for too long, it's likely to get too rank and tall and scrub will encroach, and we'll see the butterfly density decrease. So management will temporarily impact populations, but it does require some management to maintain these mid-height swards. So this can make it really tricky. So part of the research was to understand how do we manage habitats for this mid-successional butterfly species. So we did some management trials. The recommended management for lower skipper is usually extensive cattle grazing, but this isn't always possible. Some sites are, as we saw in the pictures earlier, they're really close to the coast, so it's not possible for cattle to graze there. Some sites are really steep, have really steep areas, and actually the cattle don't access those slopes. And there are some sites which just don't have the infrastructure, such as fencing or troughs. So how do we manage those sites? What alternatives are there? And we wanted to understand this. So we conducted management trials. This included 15 replicates, which had 4 2x2 metre plots, 60 plots in total. And here in the diagram, you can see with the letter A, we have cut plots using brush cutters. And then where the B is, we had rotivation. So that was breaking up the ground and the roots of the tall grass, but leaving the vegetation on the site. And then we actually combined the both. And in each year, when we collected data, we compared this to a control plot, which was unmanaged. Through this, we investigated the effects on lower skipper larval presence. So we looked at whether there were larvae present in the plots in each year. We looked at habitat suitability, and that was through grass height and food plant cover. And we also wanted to look at if there were any other added benefits. So we considered the diversity of plants as well. And these trials ran from 2017 through to 2020. So we did get quite a good time of studying these plots. So what did we find? We found that butterfly recovery was fastest in the rotivated plots, but actually the habitat recovered more quickly in the cut plots. We found that rotivation had better short-term outcomes for plant diversity, but this was quite short-lived, and after 3 years we found that the treatment plots were similar to the control. What lessons are there for management for this? We found that rotivation and cutting does provide an option for land management for lower skipper on sites where grazing is problematic and where you feel habitat is deteriorating. However, it was really important that this is at a low intensity or low frequency. I've given an overview of the ecology of the lower skipper, and what's important is it's high up in the sward for most of the year through its early life stages. So if you're managing, particularly cutting, you'll be removing eggs and larvae from the sward. So leaving unmanaged areas as refuges is really important, so you have a source population to recolonize those managed areas when suitability recovers after a couple of years. So we were able to make some recommendations for management from this for ungrazed sites. So next we wanted to scale this up. So we know now what lower skipper needs in terms of its habitat thresholds, and we also have a better understanding on how we might deliver that across a wider range of patches where we weren't sure exactly how to manage for the butterfly before. But given the restriction of this species and the population crashes, we wanted to better understand how the distribution at the landscape scale could be influenced by changes in habitat at individual sites. because this affects the number of butterflies a site can support if you've got better quality habitat, and therefore can have impacts on the landscape. I'm just going to give a bit of context. For Dorset, we've lost 70% of our chalk grassland habitat since 1930. And in the context of the lower skipper study system, you can see there the kind of broad habitat area in yellow on the map. And then in pink, we have the natural England calcareous grassland habitat area. And not all of this will be areas of tall talk grass, just to mention. So it shows here that actually there's limited scope for northward expansion for lower skipper, but there is potential to the west. However, the habitat here is more fragmented, even within the current range, than it is within the kind of eastern side of the range in the Purbex. And it's also important to mention that the habitats, the landscape here, the chalk grassland here is more heavily managed than it might be in the Purbex. So there's different land uses, grazing and farming is slightly different here. So actually the extent of habitat is lower. We know that fragmentation increases population vulnerability. As we lose habitats, populations get smaller. They're therefore more vulnerable to extinction if we do get crashes. And if we get a crash, the fragmentation means there's a lower chance of recolonization. We know from many of our work on lots of butterflies and moths how effective delivering management at the landscape scale is to make sites bigger, better, and more connected. But this can sometimes be really challenging to implement in practice, particularly where you've got highly specialized species that might require restoration of particular habitats. So we wanted to show to model how coordinated changes in the landscape, in the habitat of the sites, can affect landscape scale occupancy and potentially overcome some of the barriers we might face, particularly for lower skipper. So I'm just going to show three kind of key results from this. So this map shows the likelihood of occupancy in 100 years from 500 simulations. The purple dots show a high likelihood of occupancy, pink dots over 50% of simulations they were occupied at 100 years, and then the orange and yellow had a lower chance of occupancy. This shows that the current population of lower skipper, based on the current configurations, so size and quality of patches, well, 2017, was stable at 100 years. So we're still expecting the meta population to be occupied under current habitat scenarios. But what's interesting is there is a low chance of colonization to the west outside the range. So actually the habitat fragmentation here could present a barrier to the movement of this butterfly. We next wanted to look at what would happen at low habitat quality. And this could also reflect what might happen when we get those population crashes and the actual density of the butterfly is lower within the landscape. And what's important from here is it shows where these core sites are, which I mentioned earlier. And these are sites which the butterfly is likely to contract to in bad years. And it's important, knowing these sites is important because you can then think about how you might protect and manage them in future to facilitate the recovery of the range, particularly under an uncertain future with climate. So these are often large, well-connected areas of habitat. And we also wanted to look at what happens at optimum habitat quality. So under this scenario, the densities are really high. So the carrying capacity of each patch, which is the number of butterflies a patch can support, is modelled as being at optimum. Here we show that the current range is highly occupied across it. There's a few sites which are slightly less. But what's important here is that outside the current range, there is a higher chance of occupancy than under the current habitat scenario. And this is because the likelihood of colonization persists and persistence is increased. The higher density of butterflies within the range means that there is likely to be more dispersing individuals looking for egg-laying sites. And once they arrive on a patch, if the habitat is of a higher quality, they're more likely to find egg-laying sites and larval survival is likely to be higher and population can grow. What I will say is that these results are based on changes in the carrying capacity and of the sites, and they don't factor in the effect of climate change. Climate change could have positive effects, it could have negative effects on lower skipper, and that is still a research gap which we would like to understand. So I am going to talk a bit about climate now, but this is more looking at grassland microclimates more broadly, but there are some lessons for lower skipper from this. So I'm going to talk briefly about the work we've done on grassland microclimates. So microclimates are the conditions experienced at the scale of an insect. You can imagine if I'm walking around on a site like this, I'll be experiencing the air temperature very differently to a small caterpillar within the grass that might experience shading from overhanging vegetation, or if they're in really sparse grass, they might have heat radiating from the ground, which might amplify their temperature, and they might experience a hotter temperature than I am. It's well documented how important microclimates are for these species. We know that insects need warmer conditions for development and activity, and you see butterflies basking, particularly early in the morning or on an early spring day. And our spring caterpillars, where the sunlight levels are lower and the air and the temperatures are cooler, they're often selecting for really hot microclimates to maximize their development. However, we also know that prolonged exposure to temperature extremes can be really detrimental. And with climate changing, we're likely to see increasing frequency of heat waves, drought, or more intense heat waves and droughts. And we've already seen some really hot summers lately with temperatures getting up and around 40 degrees. We also know that the distance an insect might need to travel to escape these extremes or find suitable temperatures for development will affect their fitness. The further they have to travel, the less time they can spend feeding or breeding, and they might be more prone to things like predation if they're exposed, moving around looking for different temperatures. We often recommend manipulating these microclimates by creating kind of taller and shorter areas of grass and managing grasses over different slopes and aspects for species. And we have a good understanding of how managing habitats can create different microclimates, so including scrub to create areas of shade, how woodland microclimates vary. But what we didn't understand was how microclimates varied vertically within grass. So you can imagine if you've got a little caterpillar within the grass, it can also make up and down movements as well as moving between short and tall heights. And what we didn't understand was how grass temperatures varied up and down the sward, which is likely to be highly relevant, particularly for species such as the lower skipper, which are within the grass throughout their life cycle. What we did was we used a model to show how grassland temperatures varied vertically in 3 different grass height scenarios: 4 centimetres, 25 centimetres and 50 centimetres. And this was run for a reference site in Dorset. We also looked at how microclimates varied over time, so night and day and over the year, and how they varied over space, looking at different aspects and slopes. I'm not going to get the chance to talk about all of that work today. It probably could form a whole presentation on its own, but hopefully I'll be able to give a kind of very short overview of what we found. So we show that grassland microclimates are influenced by the grass structure, and that's height and density. So short grass is likely to be less dense and sparser, and tall grass is likely to be denser and cooler. And that affects where the solar radiation, where the sunlight is absorbed, and also can affect heat and vapor movement within the grass. So here on the plot on the left, we've got air temperature at the bottom, and then we've got height within the grass on the y-axis on the left. And we show here how in short grass, temperatures are really hot. An insect could move up to cool down, but then at the top of the grass, they might be more exposed to sunlight, which will heat up their body temperature. We show in tall grass how temperatures are very cool at the bottom, and an insect could move up to increase their temperature range. So it's likely this vertical variation within grass will be very relevant for insects such as the lower skipper. And broadly, we found that though short grass and south-facing slopes support hotter microclimates, it's actually not as simple as that. They're actually slightly more complex. I'm just going to give a brief example. Here we have leaf temperatures, so it's the same leaf temperature along the bottom, and then height in the grass along the y-axis there. And leaf temperatures are likely to be important when caterpillars are very small, or during the egg stage, when they're likely to be more in line with leaf temperatures and air temperatures. And we show that actually leaf temperatures at the hot of tall grass are as hot, or if not a little bit hotter, than they are in the short grass, despite temperatures overall in the tall grass being cooler. We also show that when there's less sunlight, or during the winter, during cloudy days and during the night, the differences between microclimates within grass heights is less. So actually this could have implications if you've got a species that might be particularly sensitive to, say, winter warming. And we also show that the effects of aspect are more pronounced in short grass, and actually for a species in long grass, the temperature variation over different slopes and aspects is quite small. So what does this mean for lower skipper? Well, mid-height grass could provide the most suitable thermal conditions for development. Short grass could be too hot with limited chance to escape really hot temperatures, and tall grass could be too cool, and this is particularly given that the caterpillars will be active in spring looking for warm microclimates. However, our outputs differ to findings from Jeremy Thomas's work in the 1980s. We show here with leaf temperatures in the green line that it's actually the protective tubes where the larvae kind of hiding throughout the day are likely to be in the coolest part of the plant. In the 1980s, the butterfly was thought to be using the warmest part of this plant, and it'd be good to understand whether this is a sign of climate change effects. So there are still some unanswered questions. So the model is really well calibrated with data from the UK and elsewhere in Europe, but we want to ground truth it with data from Dorset. And it would also be interesting to do some observations of larvae throughout the year to look at how they're using how they are using the sward throughout the year. And in understanding this, this will give us a better understanding of the microclimate associations of lower skipper. And in understanding this, we can better understand how lower skipper will respond to climate change in the future, and whether we can expect a kind of range expansion as climate changes, or whether it's going to be kind of trapped in that, restricted to the south coast. So just going to give some overview of the lessons learned. We now have an improved understanding of the habitat and management needs of lower skipper. That includes those habitat thresholds I mentioned and management techniques. We show how rotational management can be used on ungrazed and deteriorating sites to manage habitats, and this may have lessons for other mid-successional species. We show how coordinated local level management is important in these fragmented landscapes. Managing habitats to increase population density can improve resilience of sites and reduce extinction risk. And this is particularly important where populations are quite variable for lower skipper, and it's particularly important to consider how we protect and manage those core sites. The coordinated local management is also important to facilitate dispersal and improve connectivity within a landscape by increasing the number of dispersing individuals and the chances of colonisation success. And an important lesson from this is actually that managing those smaller unoccupied stepping stone sites is also really important. So when we get those years when populations really rapidly increase, they can take advantage of these sites which might otherwise be unoccupied in kind of lower abundance years. And what we also show is that how microclimates vary vertically within grass, and how management of grassland structure could be important in a changing climate. And these can help inform our understanding of how we might help species buffer climate change and the situations in which this work could be limited. So just to give some final thank you. So I just want to thank Jeremy Thomas and Nigel Bourne for leading previous surveys, for sharing all their data and expertise on the species, to my PhD supervisory team, so Ilya McLean, Robert Wilson and Nigel Bourne, for all their support and input on the work. The volunteers from Butterfly Conservation Dorset branch, who have helped collect a lot of the data, particularly the transit data. They've helped with the management trials as well. So thank you to them. And also the National Trust volunteers and staff who actually helped me set up the management trials and did a lot of the kind of management work there. And also all those involved with the collection of previous data sets, because there's a lot of people that have been involved over the last 40 years. If you want to find out more on those, I'm going to give another plug following on from Richard's for the science pages on the Butterfly Conservation website, where you can find links to the published papers on this work. And I just want to thank you for listening.
Rachel, thank you so much. That was so interesting. Rachel, we've got time just for one question, if I may. And that is, with a changing climate, I'm really interested to know what lessons that we can learn from the Lulworth skipper that could be applied to the conservation of other species.
Well, I think there's kind of a few areas, really. So the landscape dynamics that I showed, so how actually increasing the habitat quality, particularly managing those core sites, can really, under climate change, so not just for Lulworth skipper, for other species, can help with range recovery. So making sure our landscapes are really resilient and our populations are really resilient. So if you get a climate-driven crash in populations, there's enough left to kind of recover the range. And also, I didn't go into it in great detail today due to time, but thinking about how we manage our grasses to buffer climate change. So how taller grass could create some more stable microclimates, particularly in variable climate years, and how managing different grass heights can help create a wider range of temperatures. So there's a lot of work which can be applied to other grassland species as well.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel, I'm afraid we've got no more time today, but thank you so much. That's a good invitation for me to invite you back to speak again when you said around you could do a whole other talk. So watch this space, everybody. Rachel, I'm so thrilled you're here. And as I say, thank you again and congratulations on your PhD. We've been sat now for about an hour and it's always good, isn't it, to have a little bit of a move around. So we're going to just take a very short break of about 3 minutes just to allow you to sort of get up from watching and have a little move around. And then we'll be back with our keynote speaker, Craig Bennett. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to get up and have a little move around. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Craig Bennett. Craig is the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, and he has been described as one of the country's top environmental campaigners. And in 2021, he was included in the Sunday Times Green Power list of the UK's top 20 environmentalists. I can't tell you how delighted I was when I contacted Craig and he jumped at the chance to talk to you all today. Craig has been hugely successful in raising the profile of the Wildlife Trust for all of our benefit. And it is great that Butterfly Conservation is working with the Wildlife Trust as part of a new wider environmental NGO science network. Craig, good morning. I am so thrilled you've joined us. It is wonderful that you're able to be here, and I am very grateful you've given up your Saturday morning to be with us. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you so much for the invitation to join you. You know, I think the work of Butterfly Conservation is incredibly important. You're a fantastic organisation that have been there for a long time, focused on butterflies, and it is so important, I think, in the wider nature sector that yes, we have organisations like the Wildlife Trust that work across the piece and across so many kind of different issues, but also having organisations that we can partner with and work with closely that are real experts on particular species or groups of species is of course hugely important, and we're all the stronger for it. So delighted to be able to join you today. Hopefully you can see my slides okay. I was asked today to talk about the future of nature recovery in the current climate. So I'll get into that, and I wondered what you meant by climate. You might mean the physical climate, you might mean the economic climate, or you might mean the political climate. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to speak about all three of those. But first of all, let's just do my job and give you a little brief introduction to the Wildlife Trust, because I often find people think they know the Wildlife Trust, but there's a few things that might surprise you. And all of this is actually relevant to the context we're getting to today, which is why it's important to do this. 46 Wildlife Trusts, of course, we're a federation of 46 locally run wildlife trusts, along with the central team as well, coordinating that. So 47 separate organisations with our separate chief execs and boards and so on, but working in a federation. And my job as national chief exec really is to try and make sure that we kind of move like, if you like, it's like a murmuration of starlings. So yes, we're separate bodies, but we try and move together and create something beautiful and impactful by moving together. You can see why I use that particular comparison. But you know, you might know your local wildlife trust. I very much hope you do, and you might think it's sort of small, medium size. But actually, when we come together, our scale is tremendous. So we now have almost 1 million members across the UK. I'm delighted to say that we've added almost like 100,000 members in the last 4 years. I don't say that in any way to brag. I say it to make a political point. Something is happening out there that people really, really care about nature, even if the politicians don't always demonstrate that. The new members we've added in the last 4 years is more than is more itself than many political parties. So it gives you an idea of that, how much people care about nature in this country. We're well known for our nature reserves, of course, across the Wildlife Trust, and in fact we have more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants. In fact, 1,000 more. We estimate that 60% of the British population live within 3 miles of one of our reserves as well. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the Wildlife Trust, and when you put us together, we're actually one of the world's largest nature organisations like that, with, believe it or not, 3,800 staff now. I know it's mind-blowing, isn't it? Absolutely bonkers. But that gives you a sense of it. Now, I say all that because I'm going to draw on that a little bit on this. But first of all, I was asked this, as I said, to talk about nature recovery in a changing climate. And perhaps that was meant the physical climate. That might be the first thing we would assume. And I know you know all this, but it's worth just reminding ourselves, particularly as, of course, the world is meeting at the 30th Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Belém, in the Amazon, in Brazil right now. We're on the middle weekend of that. And despite all of those kind of meetings and despite lots of efforts, the sad fact is, it's not me dismissing them, because I think we have seen some impact from all that negotiations over the years, just nothing like enough. But sadly, the world continues to break records as emissions continue to grow. So we have seen some progress in the negotiations and at the domestic level as well. But sadly, we are still putting more planet warming gases into the air than ever before, and fossil fuel energy consumption hit a record high in 2024. It is therefore maybe unsurprising that 2024 was the hottest year on record globally, with this year, 2025, likely to be hotter than the peak of the last interglacial, in other words, the last warm period, roughly 125,000 years ago. And this year, we have seen the second hottest first half of the year on record, as raised surface temperatures become the new normal. You all know that, amongst other things, that means across the year, spring is happening earlier, the whole seasons are being shifted. That has a huge impact, of course, on butterflies, as you will know, but many other species besides. And the real concern is, of course, is that we're on the verge of a tipping points, that we'll actually start to see cascading risk within the climate system, with climate change accelerating and leading to runaway climate change. You often hear about the target of 1.5 degrees. In a sense, that was a political target. Of course, if we really wouldn't be starting here if we could choose it. But there is real concern amongst scientists that going beyond 1.5 degrees, and we're pretty much already there, let's be honest about it, could trigger some of these tipping points. And just last month, actually, there was a paper in Nature that suggested the tipping points around coral reefs has already started. So more than 30 years on from the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, our failure to contain a warming climate has now made severe weather events, droughts, forest fires, ocean warming, retreat of glaciers, and the warming of permafrost a living reality for millions of people. There you are, you see papers like this saying, I mean, you know, to get these some peer-reviewed papers, it's pretty stark language. We are hurtling towards climate chaos. The planet's vital signs are flashing red. The consequences of human-driven alterations of the climate are no longer future threats, but are here now. This unfolding emergency stems from failed foresight, political inaction, unsustainable economic systems, and misinformation. And of course, that has huge impacts right around the world, including here in the UK. Spring 2025 was the warmest since records began, and the sunniest since 1910 across the UK. And drought conditions hit many parts of the country through summer 2025, following extensive periods of flooding over winter 2024, with a drought status declared in the northwest of England, Yorkshire, the West, and the East Midlands. And multiple heat waves occurred in 2025 here in the UK, but of course also around the world, with big implications for public health. The impacts of climate change are no longer abstract threats confined to a post-apocalyptic post-apocalyptic future. The consequences are now playing out across the 4 countries of the UK with huge impacts on society. Extreme weather is the new normal. We just know it from yesterday, of course. So astonishing rain here in Cambridge yesterday, which just didn't stop at any moment. Extremely wet periods followed by extremely dry periods, extreme heat, greater wildfire risk, increasing sea temperatures, sea level rise, and disruptive storms. So what does all this mean? Well, first of all, we have to close that emissions gap. That's the thing we've got to really, really focus on. I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation, but it's not either or, and we absolutely need to close the gap. The United Nations Emissions Gap Report 2025 found that the country's climate pledges under the Paris Agreement have only slightly lowered global temperature rise over the course of this century. We are better than if we hadn't done anything, but we're still heading for a serious escalation of climate risks and damages. And researchers have found that there has been a significant acceleration in global temperature rises since the adoption of the Paris Agreement back in 2015. And here's the thing to really think about. When you look at all the extreme weather events we've seen over just the last 5 years, for example, how that's impacted farmers, how that's impacted wildlife, how that's impacted people around the world, the really scary thing is we ain't seen nothing yet. It's very obvious that what we're going to see in the next 5 years will be far worse again. So we need to close that emissions gap, but we also need to adapt. And with this new climate, further pressure is being placed on the natural world. And the real concern here is that, it's not just climate happening on its own. Of course, this comes on top of decades of habitat loss, decades of reduced abundance because of species, because of pesticides and chemical pollution, new developments, intensive agriculture. Our wildlife is increasingly bearing the brunt of more chaotic extreme weather and seasonal shifts. The habitats we care for, as the wildlife trusts across the UK and so many other nature organisations too, are becoming increasingly exposed to flooding, to drought, to extreme heat and fire. And we know butterflies are particularly exposed to the impacts of climate change, of course. Butterfly migration patterns are impacted, causing shifts in timing and routes, and temperature changes affecting butterfly breeding cycles and reproductive success rates as well. In this new normal, we need to address these new risks to wildlife. So what does this all mean for nature? Well, at the Wildlife Trust, we've been doing a lot of work and research and thinking about this. We found that even on a trajectory of 2 degrees, just 2 degrees of warming by 2100, and that, of course, is not where we're at the moment. Really, we're probably heading towards 3 to 4 degrees at the moment, unless we are able to get much more severe cuts, significant cuts in global warming pollution. But even if we could hold it at just 2 degrees, almost half our reserves across the wildlife trusts, remember I was talking about the thousands of reserves we have, almost half of those will be in areas of extreme wildfire risk. That's just within the next 25 years. 3/4 of those reserves will see summer temperatures exceeding 1.5 degrees of warming. More than half the reserves could see the lowest flow periods for rivers dropping by an additional 30%, while river flooding is also projected to increase significantly in our western regions. So in 2024, the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire reported flooding across multiple nature reserves after 2 months' worth of rain fell in a few days. And Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust had to close the Attenborough Nature Reserve 8 times due to weather conditions in 2024, with severe flooding also closing the site in January 25. This was the same year, of course, that you guys, Butterfly Conservation, declared a butterfly emergency after the results of the big butterfly count showed alarming declines. So with human-driven impacts from pesticide use and habitat loss already threatening butterflies, the wet spring and the relatively cool summer have exacerbated these threats. In contrast, in spring 2025, sprung, of course, in the opposite direction. It was one of the driest on record in the UK, as well as the warmest and sunniest. Northumberland Wildlife Trust's Whiteley Moor Nature Reserve experienced extreme drying, threatening the precious peat bog and heathland habitat. Worcestershire Wildlife Trust observed pools that supported dragonflies drying up in hot weather, a dramatic shift from the flooded pools during the heavy rain earlier in the year. And these experiences are swinging from one extreme to another, are deeply worrying and provide a glimpse, just a glimpse, sadly, of what lies ahead of us should we fail to address climate change. Now, our work at the Wildlife Trust has always been based on the core principles of the Lawton Review, which I'm sure you know about, published in 2010 by Professor John Lawton, where he argued that we need much more natural habitats that are bigger, better, and more joined up. And now we're bringing in additional principles as the Wildlife Trust to underpin our conservation work. Adaptation is no longer simply a long-term concern, it's immediate and potentially high impact. And we're looking at working with more flexibility, more diversity, and the ability to try and bounce back, basing on adaptation actions. In this document, the Resist, Accept, Direct framework to determine when we must let go of nature, must let go of how nature has looked in the past and consider how we can sustain it in the future. This year, we published our 4th annual report on adapting to climate change, Resilient Nature. You can get it online, summarising the many adaptation actions undertaken by the Wildlife Trust, including specific work to protect and bring back butterflies across the country. So these include, for example, Cheshire Wildlife Trust has carried out removal of invasive vegetation across sand dunes, ponds and reed beds at the Red Rocks Nature Reserve on the Wirral to support species such as natterjack toads and grayling butterflies. Hundreds of natterjack toadlets emerged from reed beds and breeding pools in June last year, showing the benefits of this work. Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust, a project that you all know about, I'm sure. Banking on Butterflies project continues with plans to confirm to build 4 butterfly banks at Trumpeton Meadows in Cambridge, where I was just this morning before this talk, through funding from the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And preliminary site surveys and planning started earlier this year. The project is also looking at how letting a patch of scrub grow may create similar important microclimates within a grassland habitat. And students are collecting data on vegetation, invertebrates and temperature. These studies continue to provide data on the importance of microclimates for adapting to climate change, as well as resulting in functional habitats that benefit a range of species. Wiltshire Wildlife Trust has added 4 new butterfly banks at Coombe Bisset Down project with Cambridge University. The banks, which were designed and funded by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, have been modified from the traditional S-shaped designs into an E-shape. And you might wonder, well, why that's the case. Well, the E-shape allows each bank to be orientated to a different compass point to test which aspects of slope, elevation and temperature are most beneficial for butterflies and other invertebrates, of course, to bask or cool down. There are plans to plug plant these banks with food plants for several caterpillar species, including Adonis and chalk blue butterflies, kickstarting their usefulness to the nature reserve's invertebrate population. And the aim here is to test the effectiveness of butterfly banks in helping butterflies adapt to climate change, and whether this is affected by different landscapes, local climates, or insect communities. This work will also look at how it works with visitors and how visitors deal with this. So that obviously gives you a little bit of sense about the nature recovery in a changing physical climate. But what about the changing political climate? And this is a tiny moment to talk about this. Because politics does matter. Obviously, as charities, we don't engage in party politics, but it's absolutely right and appropriate for us to engage in political debate where it is appropriate to our charitable objects. And of course, our view as the Wildlife Trust and for so many nature organisations is politicians across the spectrum are not doing nearly enough to ensure nature recovery. That's why 60,000 people came together in Westminster just last year at the Restore Nature Now march. I hope some of you were there as well, to demand that in the general election, parties sign up for policies to help restore nature. It was a wonderful day if you were there. There was real sort of optimism there, and all the main political parties making pledges for nature in the last election. And first of all, we did have a bright start. You know, the Secretary of State, the previous Secretary of State for the Environment, delivered a formal statement to the House of Commons. This was Steve Reed, back in July 2024, shortly after the election. And he said, we human beings are not merely observers of nature, we are integral parts of it, and our future depends on protecting it. This is why this government will begin the work of saving it. Sadly, though, it wasn't long after that, of course, that we started getting a very different narrative from the government. And I'm sure, just like me, you would have all been incredibly frustrated to hear these repeats of these tired old tropes that are suggesting somehow the reason we've got a struggling economy is down to bats and news. I mean, it really has been pretty pathetic, I would say. And just the way in which particularly the Chancellor has tried to scapegoat nature for the struggling economy has been really frustrating. To give you an idea just how there's really no evidence to back this up, the Wildlife Trust looked at all planning appeals, thousands of planning appeals across the country last year, and found that only 3% of those appeals mentioned bats and ewes. And yet often when you hear the government talking, and other politicians as well, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the bats and newts and spiders even are the whole reason the economy is struggling. It's been really, really frustrating to have this kind of political narrative suggesting that the choice is either the economy or nature, rather than I think what pretty much all the nature groups are saying is we need to integrate nature and the economy and we get them working together. We know how that can be done. And of course, the real frustration and the current moment is around the planning infrastructure bill, which I'm sure you have been following. And again, this is deeply frustrating because, of course, yes, we need new houses in this country. Of course, yes, we need new developments and so on. But we do know now how to be able to build new houses and build new developments and new infrastructure in a nature positive way. And we and other organisations said to the government very clearly early on, we will help you and work with you to do that. Sadly, that's not been happening. Instead, what we have is a bill that is in its final stages in Parliament at the moment that will be a real disaster. It will be a real weakening of our nature protection. In particular, it's removing really the mitigation hierarchy, which is obviously hugely important. Mitigation hierarchy basically says, you need to protect the very best bits of nature and absolutely make sure you do that. If you can't protect them, only then do you start thinking about how you kind of offset them with things like biodiversity net gain. And unfortunately, this legislation will essentially remove the mitigation hierarchy. And as if that's not enough, we're hearing a lot of rumours at the moment that the government is thinking about backing out of biodiversity net gain as well. So their whole approach around these things called environment improvement plans to say, well, you can build lots of new houses or build lots of new development, but only if you have an environment improvement plan that talks about how you mitigate that and offset that elsewhere. You could imagine how that could work if you've got strict adherence to the mitigation hierarchy and if you've got biodiversity net gain. In some circumstances, that could work. But if the government is getting rid of both of those as well, then I'm sorry to say that this does represent probably the biggest regression of environmental protection that I've seen in my career. It's really very concerning, which is why we're getting a bit stroppy about it at the moment. Also, there has been real delays to farm payments for habitat creation. Of course, we had the big agricultural transition as we left the EU, and there's been some positive steps there over the last few years. It's not moving as fast as we would like, and sadly, we're not seeing as much of a bigger budget as we would like for green farming, but there has been some progress. But there's still real delays in this. And right at this moment, there's real uncertainty for those farmers, particularly nature-friendly farmers that want to do the right things for nature, including for butterflies. There's just real uncertainty about the way forward at the moment. And we and others are waiting for announcements about when the next round of applications can go in from farmers for support for nature-friendly farming. But we can't be sure when that is yet or exactly what that will look like. And the really weird thing about all of this is I would say that the government, and I'd say actually all the politicians across the parties, all the main parties, just are really getting the politics of this wrong. It seems to be that at the moment, Labour, for example, or I would say people in Downing Street, both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, seem to think that what they've got to do is tackle the rise in reform. And I think because they reform, and certainly in the case of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, they don't seem to care very much about climate change. They're making a very simplistic Westminster assumption that therefore perhaps reform and reform voters don't care about nature. And yet the evidence shows quite the opposite. This is an amazing piece of research that was done by an organisation called Persuasion, polling by Persuasion, in January this year. And it just shows that there is very strong support across the across voters from across the political spectrum for the big nature organisations. And actually, particularly the Wildlife Trust does very well out of it, and particularly out of what are called reform-curious Labour voters. Now, these are the sections of the voters that, at the moment, Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves and people like Morgan McSweeney, if you've heard that name, are really obsessed about, because these are the sort of people that voted Labour in the last election but are now thinking of going to reform. You see that, we as the Wildlife Trust, we've got an 80% net positive rating from that particular voter segment, and other nature organisations very high as well. And that doesn't actually surprise me, because, actually people care very much about nature on their doorstep. It's a source of community pride. It really, really matters. And there's this kind of simplistic thinking in the Westminster bubble that climate and nature are the same issues for voters. I mean, climate change is hugely important for all the reasons we've talked about. But the way they're kind of merged together, as if, someone that one person doesn't care about one won't care about the other, they're completely misreading. And we've been pushing this point very hard, but sadly, it's still not quite landing. And a voting public is increasingly seeing the value of nature. We see these polls all the time. So we commissioned a poll from Savanta last year that showed that 66% of the UK public believe that nature is fundamental to economic growth. We need to get that message through much more clearly. So it's not either or. And polling by More in Common for Climate Outreach, published just a couple of months ago, aligns with this, finding that 83% of those polled said that they always found beauty in nature, with similar numbers saying that nature made them very happy as well. And these numbers are shared across the political spectrum. This is an extraordinary thing. Nature is what, in an ever more polarized society, nature actually unifies us. We just need the politicians to wake up to this, I'm afraid. So actually, what's really important in driving change on the ground, and bear in mind, politics can be very ephemeral. We're now on our 10th Secretary of State for the Environment in 10 years, can you believe? And we have to engage in that, we have to push that, but actually driving change on the ground is really important, that will last. And so as the Wildlife Trust, particularly over the last 4 years, we've been really leaning into community organising. We had a Next Door Nature project that put a community organiser in every single Wildlife Trusts, with the aim of bringing people together so that they could help nature wherever they live and work. And the key point about this is really listening. It's not telling communities what to do, it's listening to what they're concerned about, what motivates them, and then helping to move on those issues. And it's been a hugely powerful project. If you're really interested and want to geek out on this, look at the evaluation document again on our website, which has found that we've had a huge increase in communities taking action with the Wildlife Trust through this project. And we actually reached the programme originally aimed to reach 200 communities, but actually reached well over 1,600. So it's been really, really powerful. But I mean, the other thing, we've talked about the physical climate, we've talked about the changing political climate. What about the changing economic climate? And we are, of course, facing a cost of living crisis. We all know that. It's taking its toll on families in recent years, with incomes in 2024, 25 no higher than in 2019 and 2020, and particularly the prevalence of food insecurity and food price inflation still twice as high as it was in 2021. So that's a real problem. But it's actually interesting how, if we start to talk about living standards, and if we talk about what really matters to people, you'll see that nature is critically important now. Because, of course, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, and yet we talk about it as if it's the other way around. We too often talk about nature as if it's somehow a wholly owned subsidiary of the economy. But no, nature is entirely dependent. The economy is entirely dependent on nature. Put it this way, if you got rid of the economy, nature would be just fine. But if you got rid of nature, we'd have no economy. And of course, that was basically the conclusion of the amazing Descriptor review, which was published by the Treasury back in 2021. So nature doesn't block growth. In fact, analysis after analysis has shown that nature is at the heart of the economy and the very foundation on which growth is built. Research by PwC found that 47% of companies on the London Stock Exchange are highly or moderately dependent on nature. And the Green Finance Institute estimated that nature declines could lead to an estimated 12% reduction in GDP in the years ahead. So it's kind of madness, isn't it, that we're still stuck in this political framing that suggests it's either nature or the economy. Healthy ecosystems provide stability for business by mitigating risks such as flooding and droughts and filtering pollutants from the air and water. And nature provides the stability necessary for business as well. But beyond these practical benefits, restoring nature also delivers significant well-being and health benefits, which strengthen the foundation for sustainable growth. So if this government or any future government is serious about delivering sustained economic growth, it must recognise and support that natural systems are there underpinning that growth. Ultimately, supporting nature and its recovery is an economic necessity. We've done work across the Wildlife Trust, also looking at the huge contribution that nature makes to our health. And actually, we were involved in delivering all of the 12 pilot projects by the NHS around green prescribing. And we did some work on this that showed that if you could scale those up right across the whole of England, you'd actually save the NHS £600 million, but deliver much better health outcomes, which is about getting people out into nature, helping deal with mental health and mobility issues. So hugely, hugely important. So what does all of this mean for the future? Well, I think when looking at nature's recovery through the lens of the current climate, it is easy to feel a sense of impending doom. We know that. Yet there are positive signs of hope that actually we can bend the curve. Really excellent work seeking to take specific action to create more resilient habitats, for example, like the work that I know you've been involved in, butterfly conservation, can ensure nature can deal with climate change and try and adapt as long as we're also taking effort to reduce emissions. Crucially important in this is working with communities, researchers, farmers and businesses, and building real partnerships to deliver these practical actions together. And a voting public which increasingly views nature as important to them and is willing to hold politicians to account at the ballot box is also very important. And also building a growing understanding of the importance of nature for a stable and prosperous future. So if we can do all that in this changing physical, political and economic climate, maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to tackle these huge, huge challenges. Thank you very much.
It's fascinating, and I'm so grateful for all of the work that the Wildlife Trust are doing, particularly around butterflies and moths. We're really running. I had loads of questions myself I wanted to ask you, Craig, but we're running out of time. But I do just have a very quick one. You talked about communities, and I am so excited to see the recent launch of your Wildlife Trust community hubs. And I wondered in 1 minute, sorry that I'm rushing you, but in 1 minute, could you just tell our members what this initiative is? And the question for me is, do you predict an increase in volunteering across the sector from more diverse backgrounds?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this hugely important initiative is about giving communities the tools, which includes also the confidence to be able to take action on the matters that matter to them locally around restoring nature. And this is building on the work we did with that Next Door Nature project and seeing the huge impact that can have. But what's hugely important in that, as you allude to, is making sure that we're reaching everyone in society through that. When you look at the huge challenge that we have to do in putting nature into recovery, that is a big challenge, and we need everyone in society feel that they can be part of it, that they're welcomed, that they're empowered and supported to do that, which is why actually making sure that we're reaching and inviting in more diverse communities to do that is hugely important. And actually, I was just signing off yesterday our latest diversity report from the Wildlife Trust, which plots how we're doing on that, and we are seeing improvement, and we are seeing massive growth in volunteering and community engagement as well. It will take a bit of time, Judy, but we've started that journey, we're getting there, and I'm confident that the whole nature sector can become more inclusive and more diverse and more powerful as a result of that.
Yeah, we fully support that, Craig. And I look forward to seeing your report when it comes out. I could go on and start ranting about the government, but we definitely don't have that time for that today. Craig, thank you so much again for a brilliant talk, for being with us on a Saturday morning. I'm really grateful, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We have now come to the end of our members' morning. How the time has flown. I could actually carry on talking to Craig for quite a while. I hope you have enjoyed listening to the talks today. I know that I have. And I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank all of our amazing speakers this morning. Before I bid you farewell, I want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your Saturday morning with us. Please enjoy the rest of your weekends. Thanks again for joining us and for all of your continued support. Please take care, and I hope that we see you all again very soon. Thank you.